Good evening, everybody. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Hannah Roux and Ola Uduku tonight. I first met Hannah in 1995. I was at the time teaching at the AA, and we took a group of 16 students down to Africa, to Johannesburg, to work in conjunction with the University of Witwatersand and local people out in the former townships. I think that for us and for our students, although I grew up in South Africa, every single aspect of their preconception about themselves as urban beings was challenged by what they found there and the people they met and their experiences, especially considerations, from the pure sort of architectural considerations of climate and urban informality and flexibility to economies and economics of the buildings they were designing and the environmental issues. The work that you're going to see tonight and the talk that you're going to hear is really, in a sense, the first time that these projects in West Africa have been brought together. Hannah and Ola met at the Urban Futures Conference in Johannesburg in 1999, discovering a mutual interest in modernism in West Africa, and have been working on this project since that time. As I understand it, it's an ongoing project. This is just the beginning of the research, of drawing together that research project. Hannah Roux is an architect and a lecturer at Witwatersand, and Ola teaches and researches at the University of Strathclyde. So without further ado, Hannah, Ola.
Well, thank you everybody for coming, and I guess I really should say thank you to the University of Liverpool as well, because part of the grant which allowed us to start off this project or get this far with the completion was actually written whilst I was there. And I can see one or two former Liverpool graduates, so hello. Right, because it's going to be a double act, I'm not going to go into large introductions or anything. I'm hoping to just give you an overview of this project as we see it, and as has already been said, it's part of an ongoing project. I'll try to keep it brief, so if there are questions to be asked, by all means at the end of the talk, hopefully we'll have a bit of time for that. Okay, right, so my talk is the AA in Africa, Personalities and Networks. Yeah, here we go. Right. And effectively, what I'm talking about really is what we see as, or what we've seen as a relationship between the Architectural Association and a series of events which take place circa 1945 right up to 1971. Now there are sort of three strands, as I see it, to this research project. One is the AA graduates who were working in West Africa at the time. There's also the AA School of Tropical Studies, which was set up in it was thought of in the year 1953. The first intake was 1954-55. And this actually, again, makes 50 years to the date when the School of Tropical Studies, actually it was the School of Tropical Architecture at the time, was initiated. And on the right-hand side, obviously, there's the events that were going on in West Africa at the time. We're deliberately restricting our research to West Africa at the moment, although the larger picture is to take the whole of Africa, the whole of Africa in. So there's a sort of timeline, which those of you who've seen the exhibition will see, which basically charts the events of the era. Right, probably where to begin, and Hannah's going to discuss this much further, is the fact that the personalities who do go off to West Africa to set up these projects and so on were all very much steeped in modernism, and they were all at the CIAM conference in 1947. I'll see if I can actually use this. We have On the back row, well, I think Hannah will go through it further, but really Fry is there, Drew is there, and De Silas. Obviously, Fry and Drew go on to do modernist work in Nigeria, and they're probably best known as far as their tropical architecture goes for their work in Chandigarh. But often people forget that they were actually in West Africa before they went off to India. Leo De Silas is a founding partner of the Architects Co-Partnership, who also did a lot of work in West Africa right up until the early 60s. Right. So to give you an idea of what I'm talking about in terms of personalities and practices, top left, Otto Königsberger and Maxwell Fry, the line towards them, they were involved obviously in the AA School of Tropical Architecture. Maxwell Fry and Jane Drew obviously were a partnership. They had Fry, Drew, Atkinson and partners. What's interesting here is fellow Atkinson, very interesting person. He worked with Fry and Drew. He also worked with James Cubitt. And we haven't yet done all the research, but I suspect he also did a few projects by himself as well. So you had a series of people who sometimes, if you like, mutated, moved from one practice to the other. So to the direct right, James Cubitt and partners. Again, bringing it to the present, at the moment they still are in practice in Nigeria as James Cubitt architects. Fry, Drew, Atkinson and partners eventually left Nigeria in the early 80s. Architects Co-Partnership is even more interesting in a way. And we're very honoured to have Michael Grice with us today. He's the last surviving member of the original group who started, who were all AA graduates. He and Leo De Silas, amongst the group, were the most involved in West Africa. They employed John Godwin, who's with us today, and his wife. John Godwin worked with them for a year, but a year and a half, and set up his practice with his wife, who's here with us today, Godwin and Hopwood. And they employed Femi Majakodumi, one of the, I guess, most eminent Nigerian architects. And today they're still practicing in Nigeria as Godwin, Hopwood and Kuye. The other line goes through to Alan Vaughan Richards, who was employed after John Godwin went off to set up his own practice. He, when Architects Co-Partnership left Nigeria in the early 60s, set up his own practice, and then partnered with Roy Ibru, a Nigerian, and it was Vaughan Richards Ibru architects. Fortunately, he's now deceased. Ibru, I know, worked with Ekweme. I'm not sure what the original relationship was. Again, Alex Ekweme, for those of you who know Nigerian history, one-time vice president of the Second Republic of Nigeria. And today, as I said, Godwin, Hopwood, Kuye are still in existence. So these are the kind of, on the architectural side, these were the kind of activities that were going on. The parallel strand to that was obviously what was going on in the AA School of Tropical Architecture at the time. Now they also, once the AA School of Tropical Architecture had been set up, which is a story to do with the fact that there was a Nigerian student, Adedokun Adeyemi, who was actually, we think he was a Manchester University graduate, but he was doing his year out or whatever in London at the time. And he met up with Königsberger and asked, he said, well, you know, I'm getting a very good architectural education, but I'm not getting anything that's appropriate to tropical architecture. And with that, Otto Königsberger, who we'll come to next, helped, at that point he was still with the London School of Tropical Hygiene, but they helped set up a conference on tropical architecture. And this started the AA School of Tropical Architecture, as I said, in 1953. By the late 1950s, the University of Science and Technology in Kumasi, Ghana, had set up an architecture school already, but it was very concerned that it wanted to reorganize the school. And the then president had heard of the work of the AA, and the tropical school specifically, and asked whether they would actually be able to work with them to set up this practice, to reorganize the school. So as it was, John Lloyd, whom I'm told is actually the person taking the photograph to the left, was suggested as the head of school. At that point, he was the year master for the year one studio here at the AA, and he had never been to Africa before, but he had a sort of crash course sort of supervised by Königsberger. And he set up this school next to him there is actually Buckminster Fuller. So he actually managed to get personalities down to what was then probably deepest, darkest Africa, and that's obviously Jane Drew. So he said John Lloyd was there. A lot of AA graduates, which you'll see in the next diagram I have, over the course of about 5 to 6 years, from about the school started in 1964, and really by the end of 66, 67, the links reduced themselves because of certain events that took place. But there was this, if you like, relationship at the time between what was then by then it was Ghana and the AA school here in London, with both the tutors and oftentimes tutors from Kumasi coming out to London. At that time also they did have two Ghanaian tutors on the staff, including John Owusu Addo, whom we have a photograph of as well in the exhibition. Right, and to show that, I mean, some of these personalities were, if you like, multitasking. Maxwell Fry was the first head of the School of Tropical Architecture, but he was also busy with Jane Drew doing what he's best known for, what they probably are best known for, University College Ibadan, Nigeria. He was only there for 2 years, though, because by then he'd had the call to become a senior partner in the Chandigarh project with Le Corbusier, whom presumably he'd met, if he hadn't before, at the CIAM conference. So the other person who took over from him is Otto Königsberger. Born 1908, died 1999. Incredible history, but suffice it to say, he was born in Germany, studied in Berlin, left just before the war because he was of Jewish origin. He went via India through to Egypt before he came through to London. He was first of all actually an advisor for one of the new towns before he was, if you like, recognized, and started off as a research fellow at the London School of Tropical Hygiene. But because of, I think by then he had been known for his work, the AA, the story around the setting up of the tropical school is that at the time it was expected that University College London, that the Bartlett School would take up the course, but they had actually exhausted their funds for that tranche of, I think it was, I've been told it was a quinquennium. Every 5 years you had a funding process. So the AA stepped into the breach, and Königsberger actually helped set up the course from the beginning. But with Maxwell Fry's continuing engagements, he actually took over the running of the course 2 years later, in 1957, and ran the course for 16 years. Right, aside from that, to show how active he was, he and 4 others, Königsberger, Ingersoll, Mayhew, who's with us at the moment, and Sokole, collaborated to produce the Manual of Tropical Architecture. Again, in the display, you can see that it went into, I think it's 5 editions. That's the Arabic edition, but it's upside down. The Spanish edition. It's still being published in India, still has a print run in India, and there was also a Malay edition. So some of us have still been waiting for part 2. I've been told it was supposed to be a much wider project. But this is probably the most substantial manual that was ever published. Obviously, prior to that, Fry and Drew had written books on village housing in the tropics and so on when they'd been doing their projects in Ghana in the 1940s and 50s. But probably this is, well, seeing as it's still in print, this is probably the most known today of the publications of the period. Going back to the Kumasi School of Architecture, what was interesting there was that, as indeed the AA School of Tropical Architecture, which changed to Tropical Studies, then Tropical and Development Studies before it's sort of moving over, it was very much research being put into practice. So to the right, the Bui Resettlement Area Study had to do with what was going on at the then proposed Volta Dam project, which went through many iterations, and again, a lot of the personalities we talk about were involved in the various housing projects. But they did a resettlement area survey, and that resulted in a project which was for a small resettlement village, which the 3rd year at Kumasi School of Architecture went on to develop, which is the Bandang Kwanta scheme that you can see on the left. Also, they did the Kumasi area study, and there was actually a project they looked at, which they were going to present at the International Union of Architecture Students' Congress in Prague. So they did actually produce a lot of work at that period too, but also, if you like, the emphasis began to move slightly from being environmental conditions and so on to issues around development, I guess what you call now regeneration, issues around, you know, I guess what the very poor are able to afford, and less to do with how to build, if you like, an elegant house in the tropics. So again, these are the networks I'm talking about. You can see to the left, you've got manual tropical housing, village housing in the tropics that Jane Dew and Maxwell Fry were involved in. Alan Mayhew, who's with us, went on. He didn't go to the, he never went to Kumasi, but he was on the tropical school staff here. Although he tells me he was originally at the Institute, at the Tropical Health School around the corner. But he went on to be the advisor to the Cape Coast University in Ghana. So he also had tropical links. To the right, you've got a series of the people in red were actually some of the first graduates of the tropical school. Pat Wakely went on, or is now the head of the development planning unit, which is obviously what the AA School of Tropical Architecture eventually became. The people in the sort of orangish colour were the second generation. Interestingly, the Mumtaz, these are brothers who were both involved in the school. Some of them have gone on to work with the World Bank, the United Nations, and so on. Also, that you have characters like Max Bond to the right, Harvard-trained Afro-American graduate, Charles Polonier, who is from Eastern Europe, who are also on the staff. So again, it's sort of the world of tropical studies was bringing in people from different areas and also producing quite a lot of work at the same time. Obviously, we've already talked about the product, the kind of publications that the Kumasi School of Architecture itself did in terms of area surveys and so on. In 1966, as you probably know, there was, well, both in Nigeria and Ghana, which are the main countries we cover, both of them unfortunately went through a period when they both had military coups. For the AA school, they weren't actually politically involved as such, but with the movement of, well, the movement into exile of Kwame Nkrumah and his whole regime really moving on to being a military regime, a lot of the work began to dry up. But that wasn't exactly what changed things. To a large extent, it was the fact that John Lloyd, who was, if you like, running the school, he went on to become the head of the AA school for a short period. And with that, the links began to, not sever, but they began to die down. And unfortunately now, there's not very much in terms of linkage. Again, it's a history for the Kumasi school as well, although it's very well regarded still in West Africa, probably from its origins. This shows you the kind of the practices that were there. That's the ACP staff on their office balcony at Butemeta, Lagos. Some of the characters there are actually with us today, or the architects. They were an interesting practice because, as I said, they have these links where they were there for a short period of time, but in that period they did a lot of interesting projects which are in the exhibition, like the Bristol Hotel and Saradine School, and indeed the Volta temporary township in Agena for the Volta River Resettlement Project. This is the Max Bond person I spoke about. He, as I said, was an Afro-American. What's interesting is the fact that he built this library in Bolgatonga, which is, if anybody's been to Ghana, is in the northern region. It's had very little coverage outside of, I guess, those who've done a lot of research in tropical architecture. And also it's a good example of climatic design for what's a much drier climate than the warm, humid climates that we normally associate with West Africa. It works as a sort of courtyard, so during the day, when it's really hot, you can actually be in the courtyards, and in the afternoon and the evenings when it's cool, the warmth that's been stored in the thick walls means you can actually work that way, so it's got a dual function. It still exists, or it did about 6 years ago when I visited Ghana. But things that we're more used to in terms of tropical architecture, and probably what the tropical school at its height was most known for was tropical design in the warm, humid regions, as it was called then. This is a primary school. You actually, on your invitation cards, you've got the pristine image of what it was like in the 1950s when it was built. This was 1990 when I was actually doing research for my PhD. You can see it was still working in its original intended fashion. I did ask the teachers at the time whether anybody had sort of fallen down and broken their legs or anything, and it seems to have, if you like, adapted to the environment. I think what I should say is that there was a lot of institutional building at the time, which I'll touch on just briefly in the summary. Again, Baptist High School. Again, this is where you sort of see the beginning of the screen walling, which, again, Hannah will be talking about more in her talk, and the use of shade and so on. I think planned very well. It's a bit later than it's in the 1960s. John Godwin will tell us what the actual date is. But again, this is a school I visited, which was sort of, again, responding very well to the environment. Has much larger grounds than the former school, the primary school, so it actually is sort of set out quite well. This was part of an IDA UNESCO project, which actually had consultants work on appropriate tropical designs for schools. And indeed, the Mahoney tables and so on, or Mahoney tables that were used, were evolved again as in the tropical school here, as Carl Mahoney was one of the students, or definitely one of the staff. He was a student and then went on to do research. Right, and to show some of, at the same time, I think the other story is that there were Nigerian architects, but they were few and far between. This is one, a building that again still exists in Lagos by Adedokun Adeyemi, which again is beginning to show a lot of these ideas around modernity and the use of appropriate materials, sunbreakers and so on. It's a very tight site, but again, there were a few Nigerian architects at the time. Obviously now the balance has changed. It's much more the Nigerian Institute of Architects and so on are much more affiliated with local Nigerian architects who've been trained predominantly in Nigeria. A few are still being trained abroad. But I guess the key thing about the tropical school is that at the time there was very little architectural education in West Africa, or indeed in Africa. So it was one of the pioneering places where people could come to get. Sometimes it would be technicians and hired draftsmen and so on coming to have a crash course, and sometimes it would be students going through the course altogether. Right, so to summarize, I guess, what the exhibition, because somebody said, well, why did it stop in 1970? The exhibition particularly was looking at our period, which is really, as I said, 1945 to 1971. So taking the key dates that I guess the historians amongst us would know, World War II right up to the end, well, really the beginning of the 70s. World War II is obviously important because there was a lot of tropical research that took place during World War II itself, and also some of the key people who then went on to set up practice in West Africa had served as officers and so on. So you have James Cubitt, who was in Burma, Borneo, and also Singapore, I think, and Maxwell Fry, who was actually stationed in Ghana for some of the period of the war. So if you like, that was a period when there was a lot of interchange, people were traveling a lot, and indeed in West Africa itself, it's forgotten that a lot of there was a large contingent of West Africans who went abroad to fight for the colony, for the mother country, rather. And so that really changed things in what had then been a particularly colonial part of the world. The period that followed, the 1940s to the 1950s, had the government at the time, that would be the colonial government, realizing that it would have to appease its then citizens, so to speak, which resulted in a lot of projects, sort of educational projects, ideas of development, showing that the colonial government was thinking about the future. There were a series of conferences and so on which pushed or spurred on building programs. So you have the Gold Coast Schools Building Program, which Fry and Roux actually started doing their work in West Africa in. They had been advisors to the the colonies, but the main architecture of that period was the schools that were going on at the time were being built. Obviously, there were a series of private commissions, but I think for most of West Africa, for the average West African on the street, it's the schools, the institutional buildings that they remember of this period. There were obviously British companies and other companies who had things built for them, and indeed things like the Bristol Hotel project. But I think the schools definitely are what probably stays in people's minds. By the 1950s to the 60s, 1957, Ghana had its independence. 1960, Nigeria had its independence. At that period, it was a period of, I say, optimism. The sort of shackles of whatever colonialism had been thrown open, and both countries were relatively well off at the time. I mean, Ghana had its cocoa. Nigeria of Shell discovered oil in Nigeria finally in 1957 in the Delta region. So this was a period when there was a lot of building again. There were UNESCO conferences talking about eradicating illiteracy by 1980 and so on. Obviously this didn't happen. But by the late 60s, as I said, there were the military coups in both countries, and by the end of and even Nigeria with its wonderful oil wealth managed to squander most of the oil wealth in pretty much 2 decades. So although by the early 70s Nigeria wasn't a particularly poor country, it wasn't really, I don't think its mind was that focused on appropriate design. It was a country that was able to build things with air conditioning and so on. So the whole idea of tropical architecture and so on was giving way to, I guess, the beginning of internationalism. So that also coordinates with the time when the AA school itself, which was then off development and tropical studies, had, with the sort of thinking of the World Bank and UNESCO, changed its focus from being purely to do with how to build housing in the tropics to issues around development and planning, which in a way goes back to Königsberger's interest in planning and development as well. Now, what really happened was, at the time anyway, the AA school did have to sort out its budget and so on. There had been a discussion about the tropical school going to the Imperial College. That didn't work out, but in the end, the AA school had actually changed its name in 1970 to the Development Planning Unit, and ended up going to the University College London to set up separately as the Development Planning Unit. And it took with him Otto Königsberger, and that really ends the era here in the AA school here. We do hear that there are still sort of connections that go on. Obviously, Pat Wakely was an AA graduate himself, so that's where our research ends, and we're hoping to continue that in the next few years. Thank you.
Slip it under my jacket.
Squeeze the fabric. Just floating. It's the most annoying thing in the world to lose.
I'm not really a sound person, so it's really...
Terrific.
Okay. I'm not okay. I'm not a sign person to go see it.
I think I'll take this technical break to do some acknowledgements. It's obviously been a research project, and we've had a number of people who've either sponsored us, or met with us, or hosted us, or lent us material. So I'd like to go through the list quickly. For their funding of our research, we'd like to thank the University of Witwatersand, the University of Strathclyde, the Royal Institute of British Architects, the Centre pour Réflexion sur l'Image et ses Contextes, the Royal Africa Society, the Kwame Nkrumah University of Technology, and the Architectural Association. The practices that met with us and have lent us material: the Architects Co-Partnership, James Cubitt Architects, and specifically I'd like to name, from the Architects Co-Partnership, Sid Peachment and Michael Grice; from James Cubitt Architects, John Baker and Spizek Plucky; from Godwin Hopwood Kuyu, John Godwin, Tony Godwin and Gillian Hopwood; Fry, Drew Knight and Creamer, Frank Knight and Graham Gibson. And finally, as individuals who've again been supportive in this research, is a long list: Adebisi Adeyemi, David Aradian, Charles Coburn, Eleni Cubitt, David Dunster, Renata Königsberger, Michael Lloyd, the McFarlanes, Femi Majikadumi, Alan Mayhew, Ralph Mills Teti, Adebisi Olamuyiwa, Grace Apong Pepre, John Owuzado, Mark Prizeman, Dennis Sharp, Peter Thomas, Remy Vaughan Richards, Patrick Wakely, and Professor Wellington. And particularly like to thank Kathy Dutoy, who introduced us this evening and who initiated the contact with the Architectural Association. I'd like to now move on to the second part of this lecture. While the first half, I think, covered our first step of research that moved beyond the media record that existed of this period, primarily through, appropriately enough for Africa, I would say, through oral sources, through interviews and through meeting with people and discovering a network of personalities through conversational methods. Another approach we've taken to reviewing this last record of architecture from the 50s and 60s has been through visits and through photography. And I'd really like to talk to a photographic record, not entirely descriptively, in part, I suppose, analytically, and try to draw out a certain theme about how this architecture has sat within a network of changes, of social change, over a period of 50 years, from the time it was built to the time that we have visited it. At times I might not mention the source of the slides. Most of the slides are my own, and they're taken in Accra, Kumasi in Ghana, or in Nigeria, and Ibadan and Kaduna in Nigeria in the last 2 or 3 years. The image that I begin with here is the house of Godwin and Hopwood in Lagos, in Boyle Street. This unflattering view of the house, which was, I think, not designed to be seen from this angle, shows perhaps how this architecture of this period is wedged in between two other worlds. In the foreground is a long-standing Yoruba family compound, a single story and made of corrugated iron, which hosts a huge amount of diverse activities. And in the background is a building designed by James Cubitt Architects in the 1970s, which dwarfs it and which shows, I think, a new scale of modernism, a kind of proto-globalism that took over after the period that we have looked at. I think that this image, for me, illustrates a way in which West African modernism presents a very special case. The way it's located between African contexts, which are very strong, which have not been transformed in the way that vernacular contexts have been transformed in Europe or perhaps even in parts of Asia, but remain very resistant to modernity. And yet and between that and another scale of artifacts and of systems that really outscale it, that are part of something that is perhaps beyond boundaries. This architecture that the architects related to the Architectural Association in Africa produced seemed to straddle a fairly fragile and short-lived moment where there was a kind of holding in tension between these two different scales, between something that was idealistic and towards a kind of globalization and a kind of local resistance. I think that these tensions can be read through the image and through the kinds of slides that I've gathered together here to show how, specifically when you look at the building as a facade, when you look at its elevation, that can be read as a trace, as a kind of a boundary that shows how the tensions at play in the building actually can be located and seen on the facade of the building. I'm going to go through various stages. The initial concern with the facade, with the boundary of the building, was as a site for technical intervention in order to construct a very firm outline or boundary division, perhaps, between an internal world and an external world, between two contexts, the Western context on the interior or colonial context and an African context on the outside. Later in the 1960s, there's a period where the facade of the building becomes a site of of aesthetic experimentation, where there's an idea that these two worlds can actually be brought together and somehow synthesized through the design of the facade. Going to the buildings today, we can see that the facade, the boundary of the building, is in a sense something that's been appropriated. The building has become open to other interventions and other ways of being that are perhaps outside of the initial vision of the architects. This is an image by Gordon Cullen from 1953, the Architectural Review, which showed the work of Fry and Roux in Africa. I think that it shows an iconic kind of view. The boundary of the building, this brise-soleil element, which is so common in many of the buildings, is here shown set against a small child and some vegetation that locates it in the tropics. What happens inside the building is the construction of something dark and something cool, as against this hot outside humid place that these architects were working in. I've just gathered together some of the images that appeared in the media in the 1950s and 60s. The building includes work by Cubitt and the Architects Co-Partnership. And this was the way in which these buildings were known in the West. These offices did have branches or head offices in London, and so they were able to publish images of what they were doing in Africa. And these images are often strikingly void of people and of any notion of a context other than what is seen through the vegetation. But they do show that the edge of the building in particular has been carefully thought and modelled, largely in response to climatic issues. This work again of Cubitt, Godwin Hopwood, Kenneth Scott in Accra also shows different types of responses to the climate, largely through trying to cut the sun out of the interior of the building through various types of adjustable louvers, at the same time allowing the breeze to flow into the building. This somewhat un-African image actually does relate to Africa. This is drawn by the architectural theorist Gottfried Semper about 100 years before Maxwell Fry got to Africa. But it showed his notion of the wall of the building, which was to become enormously influential, which was that the wall of the building was, in his view, and this was a historical view supported by a trip to the Great Exhibition in 1851, where he saw African huts. His view was that the wall of the building had been constructed as a woven element, something perhaps like fabric or branches that had been put together. I think the important thing of this is that it was something that was, apart from having a climatic function, was something that was ornamental on the one hand and slightly porous on the other, that it had this ability to breathe and to not be an entirely solid thing. It was also non-load bearing. This fabric metaphor that's inherent in Semper's description of the wall recurs in the 1950s. In the 1940s. Le Corbusier, in the complete works, publishes a chapter on the brise soleil, which he claims credit for having invented. And he describes how a British architect has written him a very admiring letter, saying that he has given architecture, firstly he's made it suitable for all the countries in the world, and now he has given it clothes for all occasions. So this notion of the brise soleil as being a kind of clothing that you can wear in any place to any kind of occasion is restated there. I think that this fabric metaphor for the edge of the building is very important. Thank you. The appreciation of the boundary of the building, the way in which these buildings were set into the landscape, initially has a quality of being distanced. The edge of the building, whether it's the built edge or a sort of invisible line constructed beyond it, is one that is set apart from the space of Africa. This slide, which shows two ladies and their offspring, or their children, sitting in a kind of lawn-like thing, is an image of housing in Africa, although it would be hard to place it if you didn't know perhaps the trees. I think this was a legacy of the kind of segregated planning that was affected in Nigeria and Gold Coast, amongst other colonies. It grew from Lord Lugard's policies and concepts of cordon sanitaire, which was a space that you used to separate out different zones of the city. In this case, there was a separate European residential area surrounded by parks or greenery and open space from the better class African area. This is on the top right. And then another zone of public facilities which set off the rest of the town, the other people in the town. In practice, even where, for instance, traders worked together, there was also segregation between the plots that were given over to European traders and the plots that were given over to African traders. A building-free zone was established around a town, much like buffer zones were later used in South Africa, again to make sure that the disorder or the other order of the countryside did not intrude on the interior of the city, which had its spaces set over for staff and for European traders. In inserting modernism into the city, into the existing city, I think a somewhat different relationship happened. But modernism also did make its own space. This image, which shows a school from the 1950s by Fry and Roux in the heart of Lagos, I think shows a sort of clarity of space that accompanied the design of these buildings and that was used to sort of set off the views of the building from the surrounding areas. By giving space like this, they also were using the sort of theories of sun angles and so on, making sure that no building was built to intrude in their climatic schema that they'd thought through. This element of distantiation today is also very important because in the chaos of contemporary West African cities, the presence of cleared open areas of public space actually is very important. And one of the things that should be relooked, we feel it should be relooked at within modernism, is the usefulness of the kinds of spaces that were actually made and the restating of them. This image shows the kind of spread and the kind of rapidity with which modernism was installed in Africa. These images actually come from Kenya, but they show that over a period of, this through the a sort of measurement where post offices were built, shows a kind of measles-like, I suppose, epidemic of modernism and colonialism that affected Africa in this period. All right, now, I think that really covers the sort of background of what I want to talk about. I'd like to now go on to, as I said, three kind of moments of experimentation or of reading the buildings within West Africa. The first is just to reiterate the idea of climatic design and the way in which the edge of the building, the boundary of the building, was used to differentiate an internal and external space. There were very strong rules about how you should orientate buildings, and this was part of the content of the course in tropical architecture that students were very much immersed in. Buildings should be located in the tropics on an east-west axis, so the north and south facades, both of which got sun because the sun was very high in the sky, could be sheltered from direct sunlight. East and west sun was very difficult to handle, so it was simply blocked out by having what we call dead facades on each end. At the same time as keeping the sun out of the building, it was very important to have airflow moving through the building. This is because the humidity in most of the coastal areas of West Africa is in the 90s. That means it's very difficult to sweat and for the body to cool itself by its own natural means. There are different ways of dealing with this, including how you live your life, what you wear, and so on. But the somewhat mechanistic model that was applied in modernism was to make sure that the building acted as a kind of machine that would cool the body. So there was careful adjustment of the ideal orientation of the building to make sure that the building would catch a breeze. If there was some sort of breeze that flowed across the site, the building should be opened up so the breeze would go through. As a result, the airflow across the human body would remove the sweat from the body and make it easier to perspire and therefore to cool down. And this was done quite empirically, quite scientifically in a lot of buildings with people taking measurements. I'm sure John Godwin can give us a demonstration of how you do this. At the same time, it was also seen as a possibility for a certain kind of ornamental effect. So this image from Ibadan University shows how the opening of the building to create this sort of breeze through it was always seen ornamentally. This is a historical image from the 1950s showing the way in which studies were made in London to understand how the sun would move across buildings that were built away from London in the tropics. This is called a heliodon, and it's a machine that allows you to put the sun at any height and to model it. The crude and tropical house was, I think, a prototype that I don't think was put into production, but it was an idea for a house that could be installed anywhere in the tropics. This did have an air conditioning plant attached to it, but it also had certain passive climate control things, including a glare screen, verandas, and some degree of opening windows to allow the internal temperature to be cool. And I think that, this is an image by Architects Co-Partnership of their staff housing that they designed, which showed an extraordinary amount of passive elements being used in the building. These are adjustable louvers, sliding doors, overhanging verandas, and so on, which combined to, on the one hand, make the building visually very interesting, but on the other to make it breathe and to act like a sort of porous boundary. This is a photograph of the same house and an interior view. At the Ansar-ud-Din school, the same firm experimented with very massive opening windows. What happened here is that apart from being able to open the window to let the breeze come in, you could also adjust the kind of shadow that fell on the facade of the building, so that direct sunlight within the building itself was prevented and could be altered at all kinds of a day. The detail. All of these technologies involved a certain kind of bodily compliance, a kind of discipline of how you use the building. And the ratio of workers to colonialists in West Africa has been estimated at about 6 workers for every colonial person. So there was capacity for people to have buildings that were highly mechanized, but not through machinery, but through physical labor, and having people work the buildings in the ways for which they were designed. This particular order is one of the things that's broken down and has has, I think, was inherent in the colonial system, has not been part of a post-colonial situation at all. This is an image, again, of work by Godwin and Hopwood, which shows how precisely the windows of the school could be arranged, in this case to allow the air to flow at the level of the students' faces, at the same time putting adjustable shading, pivoting shading devices at the right angle to prevent solar ingress, and then again a top window to allow airflow to remove the hot air from the upper level of the classroom. But the discipline of placing these windows is certainly something that's been lost today, and they're somewhat more haphazard in the way that they're arranged. A lot of patent devices and elements were invented by architects in conjunction with companies, British companies, in the hope that they would make a killing in the tropical market through the design of various kinds of tropical windows, louvers, and so on. What I'd like to talk about now is how this this technical concern with the boundary was also used aesthetically, and I'm just going to quite rapidly flip through a number of slides, just showing the sort of ornamental possibilities of this kind of architecture. This is perhaps the most famous, most iconic modernist building in West Africa, which is the library at the University of Ibadan. It was designed by Fry and Roux. The outside screen wall is, has mosquito netting and precast concrete, I suppose, grills that allow air to move into the building, but at the same time shading it and keeping book-devouring insects at bay. There's a second skin which can be opened or closed, which has double doors, and beyond that are the book stacks. So air can flow through the building. If there's a storm and there's a possibility of water getting into the building, the inner skin is closed off, but then it's reopened when the storm abates. And it's been incredibly effective. This has actually continued to work technically as a passive system for storing books. But the critical thing also is that there was a real concern about what the building would look like. So that's a plan. And the back view. And a detail of the building today. I think the kind of the metaphor, again the fabric metaphor, is shown here in the cover of Architectural Design, which featured this building, showing a Nigerian house address superimposed on this image of the building, in a way showing, I suppose, two types of fabrics together. This is another detail from one of their buildings, published in a journal here. This is a slide from the University of Ibadan of a lecture theatre. And this is a building of theirs in Lagos, although I think what you see here is later. The concrete pins, I think, are later. This is again part of the University of Ibadan, in this case using timber louvers to encircle a student's dining hall. And the theatre at the same university, which has adjustable louvers so that you can darken the building completely or open it up to allow the light to come in which case all the noise of the surroundings also come in, which is quite an extraordinary feature of these buildings, is the kind of oral opening, or the oral, rather, openness of them, the way in which one's never completely cut off from the sounds of urban life. This is a library by Olumide Olumuyiwa, one of the Nigerian architects in Lagos. I think the use of murals also began, I think, initially with very abstract murals and later became translated into a cultural factor. This is one of the fried Roux schools today, showing the weathering, which has added, I suppose, another ornamental layer to the buildings, but showing this extraordinary concern with making the buildings look interesting. And that's within the same buildings. There's a lack of repetition, but a constant sort of iteration of the facade is something interesting. And this is one of their schools in Lagos, which was designed without windows, just a simple breeze block, I suppose, facade, which lets air flow through the buildings at all times. This is Godwin and Hopwood's Alum Handbury House in Tinubu Square, and it's got an extraordinary location within the city. As you drive down, very slowly, drive down the main street of Lagos, this building faces you across a very old square, across a fountain. So it's a very iconic building, although it's now dwarfed by much larger buildings. Its location within the city is very important. The aluminium louvers, I think, have been repainted. They're much shinier, I presume, than they've been ever since they were built. And they're not as well maintained as they should be. But it's extremely striking. This is a part of the reinforced concrete work at the University of Ibadan. And the same site. Incredibly fine concrete work was carried out by Italian contractors, I think, who had probably worked in Italy before the war with some of the Modernist architects there, the rationalist architects in Italy. And they achieve unbelievable thinnesses and slab and sort of depth to span ratios. And again, University of Ibadan. This is Wesley Girls' School in Ghana, which is also by Fry and Roux. And a detail of the same building. Now, the buildings I've just shown you are largely from the 1950s. As Ola's pointed out in her list of dates, the late 1950s and 1960s Nigeria were the periods of transition where African governments took over the ruling of their own countries. At this moment, issues of national identity became quite important. And there's a real concern amongst the architects to try and include in some way icons of either Ghanaian or Ashanti or local, some sort of local identity within the design. And again, the wall comes into play as a surface that shows these kinds of concerns. This is at the in Kumasi at the Upukawari school. It shows an Ashanti stool, which is a kind of symbol of royalty, and so it's used within the design of the breeze block and repeated as a motif. It's an important school because the land for the school was donated by the Ashanti Hene, so the local king. So it's an acknowledgement of the collaboration of local people in constructing, designing the school. This is a mural in the Bristol Hotel in Lagos, in central Lagos, which is designed by an Austrian-born artist, Suzanne Wenger, who has continued to live in Nigeria to this day as an artist and been given, I suppose, a religious status as a kind of shamanistic figure there. But this building incorporated quite a few designs, including murals by and floor designs by Nigerian artists. The stadium at Kumasi, which was designed, at Kaduna, which was designed to Olympic standards by Fry and Roux, again had a mural. I don't know who the artist is or the designer of this is, but a mural as a sort of welcoming element that looked to abstract art or African-inspired abstract art as a sort of statement of the building's identity. And this is a wall outside Western House, which is by a non-AA trained architect, but again, a sort of sculptural kind of elaboration. This is a mural at the basement of, ground level of the Cooperative Bank by Fry and Roux in Lagos on the marina, which shows scenes from everyday life in West Africa. Here's people are selling cocoa pods, plucking and selling them to traders, and that's where a lot of the money came from that was invested in the bank. The next stage of, I suppose, of appropriation of the boundary came when Nigerian architects and Ghanaian architects started to themselves author some of these buildings. So in this case, I think the boundary of the building is no longer something that distances or keeps out a kind of local content, but in fact becomes a site for people who've grown up in Nigeria, might have studied elsewhere, but to return and to be involved in the construction of identity through the treatment of the wall. This is the architect Olumide Olumuyiwa who designed this house, this office building for himself, Crusader House. It's also in the heart of Lagos. I think it's also again interesting that he's wearing Hausa dress while he's standing outside his very modern building. There was a use of local carvers by Nigerian architects, in this case Olumuyiwa, to decorate the buildings. And this is a building Ola showed earlier, Adeyemi's YMCA building, which has got an imported screen, but again shows this interest in the ornamentation of the building. Yeah, it wasn't entirely an affair of African architects. This is a building facade by Alan Vaughan Richards, who was a trained, or rather course in tropical architecture trained architect, but who became very assimilated into Nigerian culture and who did a lot of very interesting experimentation to try and bring forms from vernacular African architecture into play in a modernist aesthetic. And this is his own house where he's got hand-carved symbols in the precast concrete. The last stage I want to talk about is really the contemporary use and condition of some of these buildings. Without being judgmental around issues of conservation or ownership, I just want to perhaps use the images to describe what's happening today. This image, which I've already shown you, shows the corridor that was constructed to air the books at the University of Ibadan. What's happened today is that this has been taken over by students as a very cool place to sit and study. The universities in Nigeria, like elsewhere in West Africa and other countries in Africa, do have a crisis of accommodation. Students don't have good places to study. They don't have enough books. The library is a very important site for people to work, and the desks are constantly full. So a space that was perhaps conceived technically or ornamentally has today become a space of work and space that people use. Similarly, people have, in quite subtle ways, inscribed their own sort of aesthetic ideas into modernist buildings. This is in Godwin Hopwood's Northern Police College in Kaduna, where the walkway has been decorated. This is a contemporary work by, relatively contemporary work by a Ghanaian architect in Kumasi, which shows perhaps an excessive use of ornamental and technically inspired climatic devices on the outside of a post office building. And this shows a really radical reappropriation, reuse of one of the schools that was designed with pivoting glass windows. I think every single pane of glass has been broken and not replaced, and in their place, bits of shipping cartons, offcuts of timber and so on have been used to close the building off. The interior is extremely dark unless you open the windows, and people seem to be comfortable with that. When we visited the school, there was a staff meeting in place, and the communication between people on the outside and inside was happening through the window. So there's a kind of really different notion of what the functionality of these buildings might be. And this, in my final image, shows again part of the crisis afflicting some of the institutions of West Africa. At the University of Ibadan, students occupy rooms that were designed for 2 students. perhaps as 6 students or more. As a result, the gap, again, climatic gap, that was designed between the room and the balcony has become a space for living. Students move the furniture, the loose furniture from the room to the balcony so that they have more space to put down mats. A lot of students also cook on the balcony. And I think that returning perhaps in conclusion to Semper's fabric metaphor here, the fabric of very private pieces of clothing is what is decorating the building, showing perhaps a very radical kind of co-joining of 2 different conditions, of a modernism that perhaps once set things apart, and a contemporary life that ignores and works beyond those boundaries. All right, that's, I'd like to conclude there. Thank you. Ola and I would be very happy to take questions. Yes.
Well, my question is, in the early years of the work of the AA in West Africa, how do they blend the language of the modern with the vernacular prior architectural West Africa? Did you have any flashes?
I think, well, the early years would be perhaps the years prior to independence. And I think in that period there was not a lot of blending. The one instance I know of where there is some sort of adoption of local motifs is the school that I showed you with the Ashanti stool being used as a breeze block element. But on the whole, I would say that the work was looking towards Latin America, South America, India, and so on for inspiration. After the period of independence, 1957 to 1960, there was much more concern with meeting the needs of Africans, both in developmental terms, through, and I think Ola could perhaps outline how that happened at the school in Kumasi. But in ornamental terms, there was also, people were using the idea, the facade ornament. I think I've described that in quite a lot of detail, trying to look at the shapes of patterning. And they weren't necessarily looking at architecture, they might be looking at fabric. West Africa's got very spectacular fabric, and that was being used to decorate buildings. And in that region.
I mean, in a way, there is a slight difference. In northern Nigeria, the northern part of Nigeria, there was much more, I guess, acceptance of what had been Hausa traditional architecture. You probably know the work of Strathclyde and so on. In terms of the actual planning of the buildings, I think there was more of an acknowledgement that in dry, arid areas, you could work within what had already become, if you like, an almost anthropological state of living. So there was the whole thing around compounds being built. I actually did have slides of some schools that had been built in northern Nigeria, where they're actually replicating the kind of traditional Hausa compound for living, and they actually had smaller windows. But to a large extent, there was a bit of it. I'd sort of say modernity didn't represent itself the same way. A lot of what we're showing, I guess, in the exhibition is of the warm, humid area, which is where a lot of these architects were based. Although Godwin and Hopwood and others did work in Kaduna and so on, the response that you're getting, at least as far as the exhibition is concerned, is mainly located in the warm, humid zones. And indeed, Fry and Drew wrote their book, Tropical Housing. And if you look at that, they actually talk about the fact that the typical African village is untidy. There's a sort of notion about we want to move them from this to something more modern. So,
There wasn't compromising from architects, like toward the principles of modern architecture, because you were actually mentioning how to do our ornament effect in buildings when you talk about modernism. Was it like
I think it was more than that, but I think in a way it manifested itself, if you like. The boundary was what people saw, but the actual, if you like, the analysis was very much around this thing about how to attain comfort, which had been a key thing. West Africa was the white man's grave. People were dying. Before that, it was to do with malaria and so on. And with the buildings, it still carries this thing about health, comfort, cooling. But then, the way in which it's sort of interpreted in terms of art, I guess architecture, it's an artistic form. The screen wall, the brise-soleil sort of becomes the clothes of the building, which we're able to see. But I think there's a deeper meaning behind that around comfort and cool. And a European one too, because after all, Africans were living for how many hundred years without modernism in a way. But it was a new interpretation.
I was a student at the A between 1956 and 1961. The tropical studies year in the war 1956. So I was familiar with a way of answering your question is I can remember as a student, our concern was mainly comfort and how to design the wall or the building as a whole to provide comfort. And of course it was very difficult for people who were trained in this part of the world to be able to relate to the local culture. It's a little easier for me to question the idea, although that itself is also our concern is mainly with finding solutions to climate problems and layout buildings, layout of streets and so on, squares. There was a concern to some extent with the social we learn about flowers, walks, and books.
I think it fitted the functional tradition of modern very much. The whole of this climatic business that Arthur Königsberger emphasized and so on. What is interesting is what happens in the northern, as you pointed out, where there is a tradition of architecture in terms of form, which is far stronger to perceive and interpret and reinterpret and so on. And so buildings like, I would like a lot more publicity to the slide that Max Bond's library in Witwatersand, which I think is very sophisticated, which was designed in the second period, when he was with the Ministry of Works, before he joined staff at Massive in 1962. And there are other examples like that, and I think started to sort of interpret the functional tradition of the modern movement with its climatic design, what Königsberger and Max Frey, less so Jane Roux, introduced very much. So it's a sort of it was convenient.
Will your research continue into Francophone countries, the former colonial countries of France? Because a lot of work was done in Senegal, I think, by associates of Le Corbusier of Atba, and particularly Count Pontilis and others.
I must say, I think this line of design I don't think we have enough links. That's definitely an area we've been looking at, taking on the Francophone countries. But also, as I said, spreading the work to what was going on in East Africa at the same time, or maybe slightly later and further down. But yes, I think it is strange that you've got West Africa is cut up between what was British West Africa and what was French West Africa, and there hasn't been a lot of sort of discussion of convergence. Although interestingly, I know that when I was in practice in Nigeria, the Togolese cabinet makers and so on were really fine. So it was known that good work was happening in Francophone West Africa, but it was very difficult. So it is an area that we want to look at. Possibly, yes, either Senegal or Côte d'Ivoire. Because also, obviously, UNESCO had its offices in the 60s, well, it still does, but a lot of work was going on in the 60s around, again, environmental design and so on. So it is a story, again, that hasn't been. conversation with Michael Grice whilst I was doing this, and he explained how I think it was the Ansar-Uddin school, wasn't it, that was actually designed to actually allow the supposed amount of daylighting you require, which is 2%, for those of you who've done environmental design. So the tilt and the pivot meant that at its optimum you would always have enough lighting. But obviously, when we go to appropriation of space, which I think Hannah can speak to more, this has changed when the large parts of the building have been blocked off and so on. But at the time, it was a very, very technical experience, the way you were sort of designing these things. So the idea was actually to get optimum light anyway in, but also to cut out heat, glare, and so on. So it is all, there's the physics of the thing, which is, I think, out with most architects' interest, but they were actually designed to work, and that's the thing about the heliodon and so on. This was well before computers, so a lot of it was worked out manually. So that was actually looked at. But security was always a problem. I think this is where, again, we have a situation between what looks nice, the aesthetics, versus reality. And a lot of the buildings, that's part of the reason why, they've been boarded off or whatever. There's both the fact that glass doesn't last long. I mean, even here, if you look at phone boxes, a lot of it's polycarbonate, so it's not purely an African problem. But yeah, the more serious thing, especially in places like Lagos, where there's a high crime ratio and so on, the concept of the open, free, whatever, just isn't reality. So people were designing for what they saw as being possible, but in reality, things changed. Although most Nigerian houses actually have burglar bars as well, so there's that other added level. But I'll leave Hannah to talk about weathering and appropriation of space.
Well, I think the weathering you see, actually, some of it is just because the concrete was a very untested material in hot, humid climates, and it didn't react in the same way as it reacted, say, here. So I don't know technically what has caused the blackening of the concrete surfaces, but that's quite strong everywhere. With lighting, in Europe, I think the issue is to try and get as much light into the building as possible. So you open windows more, whereas West Africa is quite bright, although it's much less direct sunlight than you would imagine from these photographs. The photographs from the 50s, where they must have waited for weeks to find a bright sunny day where the sun was actually shining. They have the so-called leaden skies, where it's like grey but very bright all the time. But the pivoting windows often worked as light shelves, so they bounced the light back into the classroom. So that seemed to compensate for any shading that was put in place. I mean, I think it is a critical project to revisit all the elements of the climatic design, because all of them, and I think one you haven't mentioned is materiality. The choice of concrete as a material as opposed to indigenous materials or locally available materials is a critical thing that has to be looked at again. So I think that yes, Ola's reminding me that there were some schemes where it was proposed in quite prestigious buildings to use cement stabilized soil as a material, building material. But the word mud was mentioned in front of one of the people who was commissioning the projects, and the idea was dropped because it was seen as primitive.
So again, notions of what's appropriate and
Well, I just want to say this, that for students who are interested, many of the people who are involved in this period live in London, and you could look them up and invite them in and get them to do studios and crits and so on with you. We had to come from Africa to find them, but I don't think it's that difficult. 192, I think you go. They're all listed as you go into the exhibition. So, I think this is a resource that you should tap into, especially if you do projects in Africa, which I hope you do. Thank you.